Welcome to part 85 of my video season at Blender 2.7. In this video, we're going to be talking about gears and mechanics. In this video, I'm going to be showing you from start to finish how to create a gear simulation that uses Blender's physics engine in order to create gears that actually spin and rotate together. To do this, of course, we're going to be using Blender's Rigidbody physics simulation engine, and we're going to be using something called Rigidbody Constraints, which include things like hinges and motors to make it so that you actually have one gear that's driving the spinning motion and it's actually causing the other gears to actually spin properly, or you have gears with interlocking teeth and they actually make each other rotate. Let's go ahead and jump in. Of course, if you like this video or if you learned something, go ahead and click on that like button below this video on YouTube. If you want to see more videos like this one in Blender and Tech, click on that subscribe button as well. Let's go ahead and jump in. I'll click on my splash screen because I want to actually show you a few example gears because these are really actually easy to create using an add-on that's included with Blender. You just have to enable it. As you can see with this add-on, you can create very simple gears with any number of teeth. They can have different shapes. You can see that we have a kind of a simple conical-like gear setup over here where we have two gears where each one is diagonal. That means it has a conical shape, and that way you can have two gears that are not facing in the same direction but they still interlock and one can drive the other. We can also have different shapes and sizes of teeth on the gear, and of course the number of teeth on the gear, and you can do things like make the gear have a twisted or skewness to it or have a crown or things like that. And this is done using an add-on that we just have to very simply enable in Blender, and then you can create these gears very easily, and then we'll go ahead and create the physics setup once we have a few gears in place. Let's go ahead and jump in. I'll go to File and New and start from a brand new Blender file. The first thing I have to do is enable that add-on to be able to add gears easily to my scene. So I'm going to go up to File and User Preferences, and this will bring up my User Preferences window. And to enable add-ons, I have to go to the top tab where it says Add-ons, and there are a lot of add-ons included with Blender that are not enabled by default, but they do come with Blender. And so we're going to look for one that's under the category on this left side called where is it? Add mesh. They're actually mesh objects. So just like the cube and that monkey head Suzanne and cylinders and spheres, these gears are actually meshes, and they're in the mesh or extra objects pack here. So in order to enable this, you have to click on this little checkbox. I already had it checked. And then if you want to make sure that you always have access to these extra objects, which include gears and pipes and lots of extra stuff, you can just click on Save User Settings once you've checked the checkbox, and then you can go ahead and close this preferences window, and the next time you open up Blender you'll still have access to these gears. I'm going to go ahead and zoom in a little bit, and I'm going to delete this default cube because it's just going to get in the way, so I'll press X and then delete. In fact, I'm going to turn on my screencast keys so you can see what keys and mouse buttons I'm pressing down here in the bottom left of my screen most of the time. If I want to go ahead and add a new mesh gear object, it's really simple. I'll go down to the Add menu and go to Mesh. And of course, I could just press Shift A on my keyboard. Shift A brings up the Add menu anywhere where my mouse is on the screen. So I'll press Shift A. I'm going to add a mesh, and they're under Mechanical. This is a new sub-menu that you'll have once you enable that add-on that we just did. And then you'll have access to pipe joints. We're not going to talk about these in this video, but I'm going to add gears and gears. Okay, so once you do that, you get a very simple, basic gear. Now before you do anything to this gear, before you select anything else or move or rotate or scale it or anything, you need to go to the bottom of your tool shelf. That's this panel on the left hand side. If you can't see it, you can press this little plus, or you can press the T letter key on your keyboard, and that will either hide it or show it. And then at the bottom of this tool shelf, if you don't see the section, you can press this little plus to show it. This is where you can customize the gear. Again, before you move or rotate or scale or do anything else in your scene, you have to do this right away. Just like with any other mesh, like a cone or a cylinder, you have to customize it before you move on to do anything else. Otherwise, the section will go away. So of course, in this section, we can customize the gear's number of teeth. I can turn it down to 2 or up to as pretty much as high as I want. I'm going to set it to 14, and I'll press Enter. You can change the radius, the size of the gear, so I can make it bigger or smaller. You don't have to use the scale tools. You can just do it right away here. Of course, you could scale it later if you want. The next thing I could change is the size of the hole in the middle of the gear. So that's called the base. And there is a little bit of a flaw with this because it is so easy to fix. I think they just didn't bother fixing it when you're making it. And that flaw is that there's no inside wall. It looks like the gear is hollow. You can see into it. You can see the back faces of the other side of the gear. That's not nice, but you can fix it really easily. We'll talk about that in just a sec. The next thing we can change besides the radius, width, and base are these two funny words called dedendum and addendum. And what these are talking about are the properties of your teeth. You're changing all the teeth at the same time because they should all be the same. The dedendum is the part of the tooth that ends in a dead end. Get it? Dedendum, dead end. It's this part of the tooth that ends by butting into the round part of the gear. If you make this value larger, the dedendum will get longer. If you turn this down to nothing, you'll have no dedendum. You'll just have the extra little part called the addendum. So I'm going to turn my dedendum up to the 0.1 and press enter. That'll give me a little bit of a flat section. And then this addendum is this extra little part that sticks out from each tooth that in this case is a little bit diagonal, but it does not have to be. So I can turn that down to nothing, or I can turn it basically nothing. 0.01. I guess you can't turn it all the way off in my case. Or you can turn it way up and you can actually make it go too far. You won't want to do that. So I'm going to leave it at maybe about that, and I'll change my dedendum to be a little bit longer. Let's say like that. Now, if you want to customize how angled the addendum is, you can change the pressure angle. So you can make them very, very pointy or not pointy and just go straight out. It's up to you. When you're working with gears, of course, the reason why you would have these angled is so that the teeth can more easily slot into the next gear over, and so they won't get caught. I would recommend having some pressure angle and not just having straight out or no addendums at all. You need to have a little bit of wiggle room between the teeth when they interlock. The next thing you can change is you can change the skewness. That means having like a corkscrew kind of a shape. This won't actually let you go all the way around. It'll start to mess up, but you can make it a little bit skewed. I'm not going to bother. I don't know that much about mechanics. I've never built any kind of complicated machinery. My level of expertise is basically changing a bike chain on a bicycle. So you can imagine that I don't know that much about why you would need a skewed or spiral gear. The next thing you can change is the angle of the gear. So you can make gears that don't just fit into each other that are next to each other. You can make them have a conical angle. So I would imagine that if you have an angle of 45 degrees, that you can make two gears where they are at 90 degrees from each other, and they do interlock fairly well in the Blender Physics engine. But I'm just going to leave it at 0 for now. The last thing you can change is called the crown, and that's where you might have the teeth going up or down a little bit if you have the gear upside down. I don't know why you would have that. I'm just going to leave it at 0. Someone might just let me know in the comment section below why you would want a crown in a gear. If you can explain it in simple terms, that would be great. So I've got the gear that I like. Maybe I'll make it a little bit thicker like that, but I'm happy with that. The next thing I want to do when I'm finished customizing it is fill in this inner wall. I don't want to be able to see the inside of the gear, so I'm going to press tab to go into edit mode, and what I want to do here is press A to deselect everything because everything was selected by default, and then I'll hold Alt on my keyboard because I want to select this edge loop and this edge loop at the same time, and then use a tool called Bridge Edge Loops. So I'm going to hold Alt, right click on one of these edges with Alt held down, and that will select this first edge loop, and now I can hold Shift and do the same thing with the bottom one. So I'll hold Shift and Alt and right click on this one, so I now have both edge loops selected. And now in edit mode, if I press W, I can select Bridge Edge Loops, and that will connect the two selected edge loops together, assuming that they have the same number of vertices in both selected edge loops, which in this case I do. So now I get a nice inside surface, which I did not have before. I'm going to go ahead and add a cylinder that runs up and down in the whole of this gear. So I'm going to go ahead and press Shift A on my keyboard. I'm going to add a mesh cylinder. I'm going to go ahead and scale this, but first I'm going to go to my top view. So I'm going to press 7 on my numpad, and I'm still looking at my scene through perspective view. So if you're not familiar with this, if you use your numpad and press the 5 key on that side number pad on your keyboard, it will switch into orthographic. Of course, you can go always, if you don't have a number pad on your keyboard, to view, and you can change your views here, or you can use this toggle between perspective and orthographic views with the 5 key right there. Okay, so you can use that. But I'm going to press it to go back to orthographic. That way you can see things straight on in your scene. And I'm going to tap S on my keyboard to scale this cylinder to be almost as big, although a little bit smaller than to fit inside the hole nice and snug. You don't want it too tight. You want a little bit of breathing room there. Because the physics engine is not that accurate, and we will have a little bit of a margin between all the objects in our scene. Let's go ahead and make that cylinder a little bit taller. So I'll tap S and then Z on my keyboard, make it a bit taller, and then move that straight down. So now we basically have our setup with one gear and what's called a spindle or a cylinder. I'll just call it a spindle when I can remember that word. I want to show you how to create this into a physics scene and create what's called a hinge. But it's actually 2 ways of creating a hinge. So I'm going to make a copy of both of these objects so you can see the process of creating a hinge in 2 ways. So I'm going to select both of these objects by holding Shift, of course, and then I'll press Shift D on my keyboard. Shift D duplicates, and then I'll tap X on my keyboard to move that straight over, and I'll just click to put it over there. To make these objects a part of a physics simulation, we'll need to go to one of 2 places in Blender. We can go over to the Bouncing Ball Physics tab over here in the Properties window, but probably more easily you can go over to the side of your tool shelf and go to the Physics tab, and we're going to make the cylinder or the spindle a passive object in our physics simulation. A passive object will not be affected by gravity, and a passive object cannot be pushed or tumbled. It sort of stays locked in place, but it will collide and interact with other things that can move in your physics simulation. So this is not going to fall, it's not going to spin, it's just a static cylinder or spindle. The gear, however, does move, and it will interact with other things and cause other things to move or be moved itself. So I'm going to go ahead and select the gear and make it an active object in my simulation, and you'll notice that when you select things that are part of your physics simulation, they'll now have a green outline once you press one of the 2 buttons. Okay, so these 2 objects are now part of the physics simulation. I'm going to go ahead and press play down here, or Alt A is the keyboard shortcut for play, and I'll see what happens. Okay, so obviously the 2 objects do interact. The gear did fall down after kind of acting very strangely. I'm going to go ahead and press escape on my keyboard because there are obviously a few things we need to adjust here. We have to adjust how the objects collide with one another. So I'm going to go ahead and select the spindle first, and over here in the properties window under the bouncing ball tab, I'm going to look at what's called Rigidbody Collisions, and these settings have to do with how this object collides or considers itself an object and collides with other objects in your scene. By default, the shape that this cylinder or spindle uses is called a mesh, and a mesh is basically a force field around an object based on the object's actual mesh to determine how and when and where it's going to, or how and where rather, not when, it's going to collide with other objects. You don't have to have an object actually behave like its own shape. I could say this object should just have a box around itself, and that box is where it thinks that it's colliding with other objects. A mesh is much more accurate. It actually uses the base mesh, so if I use this mesh setting, it will actually collide fairly accurately with other objects. But in this case, I'm just going to use what's called a convex hull, and that's basically a simplified version of the same mesh. It uses the mesh but simplifies it, and that should be fine. For the gear though, I don't know why it does this, but for passive objects it uses a mesh by default, so I have to change that there. But for active objects it uses a convex hull type, but convex hull types, again, they're based on a mesh, but they're simplified. They cannot have holes in them, so this gear obviously has a hole in it, so a convex hull will not work. I'm going to go ahead and press Ctrl Z to put that back down where it was. So I'm going to change the collision shape of the gear to a mesh. Let's go ahead and see how this behaves. If I press play or Alt A on my keyboard, it behaves a little bit better. And if yours doesn't behave like mine, that could be because you have a different spacing between the cylinder and the gear. or the spindle in the gear rather. So you might want to adjust that, but it's okay if you don't want to adjust it or if yours isn't working exactly the same, because there are a few more settings we can play with. The main one is this margin, and by default it's 0.04. That's quite a bit of a margin. That means it won't let objects, or it'll detect a collision a little bit away from the surface of the collision shape, in this case the mesh. So if I turn this down and I let the value 0.01, it won't collide until it's closer to the actual mesh. So if I go ahead and press Alt-A on my keyboard, it follows much more nicely. We could also change the friction amount on this object. So I'm going to actually turn this down to 0 because I don't want any friction. So if I go ahead and press Alt-A again to play, it follows nicely. I can also change those two things, margin and friction, on passive objects as well. So I'm going to enable collision margin and type 0.01 and turn my friction all the way to 0. So now that should fall very, very nicely. But I don't want the gear to actually fall, I want to stay in place. So you might be tempted here, especially if your gear is facing left and right. If I go to my front view with the 1 key and then tap R and then -90 and enter to rotate this all 90 degrees, to just leave it like that. You know, if I press Alt-A, the gear might stay kind of where it should, especially if I'll press Escape to stop it, especially if I put the gear sort of over there and press Alt-A again. Maybe it behaves kind of like it should. That's not ideal. What we want here is a constraint to make sure the gear stays where it is, but it is allowed to rotate when it comes in contact with other objects that would cause it to rotate. So we're going to set that up. That's using what's called a hinge, and there are 2 ways you can actually create a hinge, and you'll see the pros and cons of each one. I'll go ahead and press Ctrl-Z a few times to get this back to be pointing up and down. The first way to create a hinge is just by adding a constraint to your static or passive object. So with the cylinder or spindle, that's the word I was looking for, selected, I'm going to go up to the bouncing ball tab, and I'm going to click on this button that says Rigidbody Constraint. That'll add a rigidbody constraint to that object. So once I do that, I get a new section down here. You can only add 1 rigidbody constraint per object. So I'm going to go ahead and now select 2 objects to tell this constraint what objects I want to constrain to another. The first object should be this object itself, the actual spindle. So I'm going to use this little eyedropper here. I could just click and find the name of object, but I haven't named my objects well. So I'm going to use the eyedropper. Click on that object. The first object is the cylinder itself. The second object is, of course, the gear, so I'll select that. And if I go ahead and press Alt-A on my keyboard, you'll see that it actually doesn't fall anymore, which is great, but I can't tell if it is moving without interacting it with another object. So what I'm going to do actually is press Escape, and then I'm just going to go ahead and select this other cylinder or spindle and make it an active, or actually a passive object for now. And I'm going to re-simulate. I'll press Alt-A, and while it's simulating, I can actually grab that object. I'm actually just going to bonk it against the gear, and maybe I need a better angle on that, so I'll press G again, and can I get to spin? Oh, okay, I actually have to pause the video there because I missed one important step. There are different kinds of rigid body constraints, and by default, when you click and add a rigid body constraint to your cylinder, it adds a type called fix. That means you're basically fixing or affixing one object onto another, and that's what this rigid body constraint has done in this case by using this fixed setting. What we want is a hinge, and it keeps these same settings down here, so I'm just going to change fixed to hinge. And now if I go ahead and again simulate by pressing Alt-A on my keyboard, it'll look fixed until I go ahead and grab another object and cause it to spin. And as you can see, it's acting like a hinge should. You can think of a hinge being like a door hinge. I'm going to go ahead and escape to stop that simulation. A hinge you can think of like a door hinge. A door hinge is a joint that can only move or spin in one way. So that would be something like a door hinge, or your knee can only bend in one way. This works in a similar way, although you can define where the spinning actually is based on the first or passive object's center on its own z-axis. So it's going to spin around wherever this orange dot is in the middle of the first static or passive object. So that's how you can create a hinge one way, and it's sort of a manual way. You have to add the rigid body constraint yourself. You have to select the two objects yourself, and unlike me, don't forget to change fix to hinge. There is an easier way though, and that's why I'm showing you two versions. I'm going to go ahead very quickly, select this passive spindle. I'm going to make sure that it is it has a convex hull shape. It should have a margin of, I'll just set these up again, 0.01 and no friction. The gear again should be active. I can also do this over here, rigid body and active, and it'll have a mesh collision shape. Again, that's very important. A margin of 0.01, a friction of 0. So now if I go ahead and simulate, it should just fall nicely like the other one did. To add a hinge constraint in this case, I'm just going to select these two objects in the correct order. So I have to select the passive object first, in this case the spindle. I'll hold shift, select the gear, so they're both selected, but in that order, passive and then active. And then over here in the physics tab in the tool shelf, I'm just going to click on connect. And this will set up that constraint in almost the same way, but before I do anything else, I'm going to change the type down here. When you press connect, it'll bring this new section up. The type has to be not fixed again, it has to be hinge. Now, the difference between doing it this way is you don't have to set up any of those settings at the bottom of your bouncing ball tab like I had to before. The other difference here is that it gives me another third object that acts as my hinge instead of the actual spindle acting as my hinge. It's given me, actually, I'll press Z to go into wireframe mode, and if I kind of fish around a little bit, it gives me an empty object, this little kind of directional pointer arrow thingy. That's what it is. It's called an empty, and if I move that up, it'll still work just fine, but this object is basically, it has itself the constraint on it, and this empty is pointing to the gear and the cylinder, and it has the hinge. So it is actually going to work exactly the same, but it has this third object. This gives us a little bit more flexibility in how we want the gear to move, so I would recommend you do it this second way if you want to have a hinge constraint between two objects. I can move again this up and down, and if I move the entire thing, I want to select all three objects. So if I want to move this gear over to touch and intertwine with the teeth of the other gear, I would select all three objects and then just move it over, in my case, on the x-axis. And now I can go ahead and select that gear. I'll go to my top view and rotate it in place. And I'm going to move it over and away just a little bit so they don't overlap at all. So I've got two hinges set up, and now I need a motor. So I'm going to go ahead and actually test this all first. So I'm going to make a third object. I'll just go and create, let's say, a mesh monkey head over here. It needs to be part of the physics simulation, so I'll make it a passive object, and it has a mesh deformation type. And I'll go ahead and press Alt-A on my keyboard to simulate. And now if I grab with G the monkey head and spin it, you can see that both of my gears work together, so it works. Let's go ahead and add a motor object now. So I'll press escape again. I'll delete that monkey head. I'm going to add a new gear over here. So I'll press Shift A on my keyboard, add mesh mechanical gear. Oops, add mesh mechanical gear, and I'm going to customize it. I'm going to make this one smaller because when you make a smaller gear, it will have to move at a different speed if it's spinning and intertwining with a gear of a larger speed, but it'll have to have the same size of teeth. So I'm going to change the radius of this gear, but that of course makes all the teeth smaller, unfortunately. This gear add-on could work a little bit better in my opinion. So I'm going to have to change the size of the teeth, or the number of the teeth rather, to kind of match, and I think that's about right. I think 7 is about more appropriate. I'm just sort of looking at it and seeing how big the teeth are and if I think it'll work. That looks pretty good to me. I think the teeth are the same size. We didn't change the addendum or dedendum sizes after our first and second one, so it'll remember my settings for those two from the other ones that I created. I'm going to make this a little bit not as thick. And I think I'll leave it at that. So I'm going to go ahead and press Tab to go into edit mode. I'm going to hold Alt and right click, and then Shift and Alt and right click, and then W and bridge edge loop. I'll press Tab to go back into object mode. We will have a little bit of a funny thing that might happen to us. It won't actually happen, but I'll show you what could happen when we rotate gears and use hinges and the next thing, which is called motors. And that's because hinges only work on a specific axis. So I'm going to go ahead and show you what that means. I'm going to add a cylinder to act as my spindle. I'll tap S to scale that down. I'll go to my top orthographic view, and I'll make it about that size. When you're simulating in the Blender Physics Engine, it's always a good idea, I didn't in these other cases, to apply the scale of your objects after you've pressed S to scale, or you've customized it using the gear customization tools in the tool shelf. So to do that, to apply the scale of objects, you'll need to go down to the Object menu and select Apply and Scale. If you use rotation and scale, that's not a bad idea, but you could run into problems, especially using hinges and motors, and you'll see why in just a moment. I'm going to apply the scale of the second gear, or the third gear actually, and I'll tap S and then Z on my keyboard to scale the spindle up and down, and I'll move it down, and I'll go ahead now and of course Object Apply Scale to make sure it knows that it's that size. I'm going to rotate it at 90 degrees, so I'm going to select both of these objects and tap R and -90 and enter, and I can move those up. And I'm going to have to try to make it so that the teeth kind of fit properly in the teeth of my original two gears, and I might have to do a little bit of scaling, but I think that looks pretty good. I'm going to leave a little bit of leeway so they're not going to perfectly interlace. I want some room because there is a little bit of margin between the objects, so I'll see how that does. I might have to play around with it a little bit. I'm going to go ahead and make both these objects part of my physics simulation. So the spindle will of course be passive, the gear will of course be active. I'm going to make the active object have a collision shape of a mesh, and it'll have a margin of 0.01, and friction, I'll turn it down to 0. This will be a passive object with a convex hull shape and a small margin, and no friction as well. I'm going to go ahead and create my hinge in the second way, and you'll see why. So I'm going to select the passive object, hold Shift, select the active object, and connect them with a hinge. Now, this hinge is not going to work properly, and this is where the direction of the hinge matters, and it would be trickier if I had done it the first way, if I had just made this first passive object the actual object with a constraint on it, which it is not in this case. We might have more problems, but hinges only work on the local z-axis of the hinge object. What that means is that if I try making this hinge work now, and I'm going to press Escape, and I'm going to add another one of those monkey heads, and I'll scale it down in this case and go to my front view and kind of put it up there and be right there, and I'll make it passive and I'll resimulate. If I try to make this gear spin and I hit it with the monkey head, it's going to spin in the wrong direction based on the wrong axis because, and I'll press Escape a few times, this empty is not pointing in the right direction. It'll spin around this z-axis. So if I move this way back and try that same thing again, I'll go and simulate the scene, Alt-A, and then grab this, and G, it'll spin around wherever that point is. What I want to do, I'll press Escape, is rotate this. So I'll go to my side view with the 3 key, and I'll rotate it R, -90, enter. And now it'll rotate around that middle point on the z-axis. So let's go ahead and try that again. I'm going to simulate, Alt-A, and if I can bring that forward a little bit, actually, there we go. You'll see that physics objects do have some give, so you can push them around a little bit, but you won't have a monkey head that's going around in your scene probably, so I'll go ahead and press Escape. It doesn't matter which direction this is pointing. It could be pointing so that the Z is pointing towards the gear, or if you rotate it 180 degrees, X 180, that would be just as good, so it really doesn't matter. To make this gear act like a motor, though, I need to add another constraint, and this is where you really have to have separate empty objects that act as your constraint objects, because we're going to make another object as a motor, and we couldn't have both the hinge and the motor on this one spindle. So I'm going to go ahead and select the spindle. I'll hold Shift, select the gear. I'm going to add another, I'm going to connect it again to add another constraint. I'll do that, but right away I'll change my rigid body constraint type to a motor. And once I do that, we're going to get another empty with another constraint with the motor setting already enabled and the two objects already selected. But in this case, motors have to spin on their local x-axis. So it's pointing in the wrong direction right now. I want to point in the same direction through the middle of that spindle. So I'll type R and then Z and then 90 for 90, and then I'll tap enter. Again, it doesn't matter if you have R and Z and 180 like that, as long as the X is pointing through the middle, either away from or towards the spindle, that's okay. If I go ahead and press Alt-A now to simulate, nothing will happen because the motor hasn't been turned on. I'll press Escape, and with the motor empty selected, I'm going to enable angular motor, and I'm going to change the target velocity after we get it simulating, but it has a target velocity of 1 right now. You'll see what that looks like. Aha, the motor is working and the teeth are working a little bit wonky. They're pushing around the bottom one a little bit. So I'm going to see what I can do with that. I might try moving all of these objects a little bit away, and I'll back, in other words, and a little bit down to see how that works. I think that gear might be a little bit too small. Yeah, so let's go ahead and try re-simulating that. It's not working too bad. It's not exactly the right size. Really, you should have a gear that's half the size of the gear before it. In other words, they should be multiples of one another in terms of their size in order to have the gears be the same size, twice the size as compared to the overall radius of the gears. In other words, you should have gears that are twice as big as one another, including the teeth, that will then get twice as big compared to the smaller one's size, if that makes sense. It's not working too badly here, so let's go ahead and move on. If you had this object as the motor or the hinge, and you found that if you went and looked at the local axis, I'll go ahead and select the local gizmo orientation, you'll see that the z-axis still points along the up and down really direction, or the length direction of the spindle or cylinder. That's why this cylinder, actually I believe it's this one actually, is able to work, because its local axis is pointing, or local z-axis is pointing up and down. But if I went to Object and Apply and Rotation, or if I had rotated the cylinder in its edit mode instead of its object mode, I might have a cylinder that points in its not z direction in its up and down, or its length of the cylinder. So in this case, if I go back to global or local and I go to Object, and I rotate it, let's say 90 degrees, R90, and then I go to Object, Apply, Rotation, and I R-90 it back. If I look at its local axes, it's no longer correct. So if I tried to simulate this, it wouldn't work properly, because this object is acting as the hinge and it's not pointing in the right direction. So this gear is trying to spin this way as opposed to this way, okay? So I'm going to go ahead and fix that. I'm going to go back to my front view. I'm going to press R90, and then I'm going to apply the, actually I don't even have to do that. I'm going to go ahead and apply the rotation, and then the local direction will go back to being the z direction going on the length of the cylinder. So now it should work pretty well again. So that's how you create a gear setup. In the last part of this video, I'm going to make it so that my scene looks good and render it out into an animation. There are a few other quirks about working with a rigid body simulation in Blender, and that is that orange bar that we can see when we select any of the active or rigid body objects with a green outline. It's this orange or yellow bar at the bottom of our timeline. What that indicates, or what that's actually showing us, is that there is a rigid body simulation cache, a piece of memory that holds how these objects are moving after we've pressed play and simulated through our scene. As soon as I start messing around with the playhead though, that cache goes away and the objects are no longer simulating. So how do I make a simulation permanent is the important question here. If I can't move my timeline, the simulation isn't very good for me. I want to render this out to an animation. So what I want to do here is go back to the beginning and press play and simulate all the way through. In this case, I'm just going to leave my timeline to 250. And if I want a shorter amount of time, I can just change the end value here, and that's great. Now, once it's simulated all the way through once, I'll press escape. And I have to go over to my Scene tab, and I have to do what's called Bake the Rigid Body Cache. So I'm going to go ahead and open that section up under the Scene tab, Rigid Body Cache. And what baking means is it basically makes your simulation permanent. It kind of keeps it and saves it so that you can go ahead and edit other things in your scene and move throughout your timeline and not worry about your simulation later. What I want to do is press this current cache to bake. That means it'll take this current cache and actually make it permanent. Of course, I can always unbake it later if I want to make changes, but I'll go ahead and press current cache to bake. That'll make that orange or yellow bar dark. It'll save it. Once you press it, it'll do it for the entire simulation, so all these objects have now their simulation baked, and so I'm pretty well good to go. If I do want to later change this simulation into keyframes, what I can do is press A to select everything in my scene. I can press A a few times, and then if I go over to the physics tab in the tool shelf, I can click on Bake to Keyframes, and what that'll do is it'll take my simulation and it'll kind of remove these objects from the simulation, but it'll change the simulation into keyframes so I could edit it later or do whatever I want to do with my keyframes in my dope sheet window, and you'll see that in a sec. So what I'll do is I'll click on Bake to Keyframes. I'm not going to make every single keyframe in my timeline. That means 24 frames per second have its own keyframe. I'm going to just skip to every 5, I think. And that'll be okay. I'll press 1 to 250. By the way, I'm just going to escape for a sec. If you want more than 250 frames in your simulation, you'll have to change this in a couple of places. You have to change your end value on your timeline, let's say 500, but that will not allow your simulation to go that far. That's just your timeline. In order to increase your simulation length, you have to change your end value in your rigid body cache. In this case, I can't change it because I've already baked my simulation, but you could change this value and then simulate your entire scene as long as you want, as long as this value goes to that length, as well as your timeline end value. In this case, I'll just leave it at 250. I'll just leave that one. Let's go ahead and select all the objects in my scene with the A key. I'm going to click on Bake to Keyframes, and it'll let me select how many keyframes or how often I want keyframes. In this case, I want 5. And so now I have a keyframe for my simulation every 5 keyframes. Again, if I want to edit those keyframes, I can just make another window. It'll be a dope sheet window. And there you can see I have keyframes for all of the objects. You can see one object at a time if you click on this little arrow, and then it'll only show you the keyframes for the selected object. You can see that my passive objects don't have any keyframes because they don't move. Only the active objects have keyframes, and that's great. Let's go ahead and render this out to a good looking scene using the Cycles Render engine. I haven't even changed my scene or file to the Cycles Render engine yet, so let's go ahead and change that. Cycles Render. What I want to do is set up my camera, so I'll press 0 on my number pad. I'll get rid of my dope sheet window. I'll just right click and then join areas and get rid of that. I'll move my camera around, but to do that, I'm going to go to my property side panel and click on Lock Camera to View under View. So now I can spin or orbit through my camera to move my camera around. I'm going to be zooming it a little bit and go to right about, I like that. Now, in order to make this look realistic, I'm going to adjust the lighting and materials, and I'm going to add some depth of field blur, because generally cogs and gears like this would be quite small, like inside of a watch or clock. So I'm going to add some depth of field blur. I'm also going to add some motion blur, and we're going to make it look all nice. Let's go ahead and see what the scene looks like when it's rendered out, and that's what it looks like. Not too good. I'll change the world color to almost bright white. I'm going to go ahead and add some materials here. I'll select, let's say, that bottom farther spindle, and I'll click on the material tab, and I'm going to add a new material, but I'm not just going to use a diffuse material. I haven't made a video on this, but I'm going to use the principled shader. This is a new shader. If you're using a newer version of Blender, like Blender 2.79, you'll have access to this. This allows you to create a much more realistic scene with more realistic looking materials this way. All I'm going to change though here is the base color. I'm going to select a base color. It'll be like an orangey yellowy color. I kind of like that. Once I have this material once, I'm not even going to bother naming them. I can just select other objects and then add them to that. I'm going to go ahead and make the gear, have a copy of it too, but I'm going to press this little plus to make it a different color, and then or a copy of that material rather, and then I can change the color. Let's go ahead and make it a blue color, and I can now select that object. I know it's hard to see what you're selecting when you're looking through render view, but it's not too hard to tell what you've selected because the material goes away. Okay, let's go ahead and select that farther motor spindle. I'm going to give it that same material, but I'll make a copy of the material, and I'm going to give it a slightly different color. Let's make it a greeny color, and I'll select that gear, and I'm going to select the blue, but press plus to make a copy, and it'll be kind of a purpley color. Like that. Again, these gears don't fit perfectly together. You can see that this side is getting pushed down a little bit, and this gear is getting pushed up a little bit, and that's okay. I'm not going to be too picky about it. You can be if you want. You'll notice that there's some mirroring going on here, and that's because you can see a reflection here. That's because there is not enough roughness on this object. If you have really smooth objects, if you haven't applied like a bump map or a normal map, you'll have a fairly smooth object. And so with this principled shader, what that means is that you're going to have basically a mirror or a sheen. So I'm going to actually up, where is it, the roughness of all these materials, especially this orange one. So I'll select that object, and then I'm going to turn up the roughness, and that will get away, especially if I turn up quite a bit. That will get rid of the oops, I actually have the blue material selected. That's okay. I'll go ahead and select the yellowy orange one and turn up the roughness as well, and we should get rid of most of the reflection, at least the clear reflection there. So that's good. I'm going to select the purple material and turn up the roughness as well, just so we don't have really clear reflections. Now, in order to add a depth of field effect, by the way, I do have a video on adding the depth of field effect. That means a blurriness close to and far away from the camera. This is the effect that you would get. It's called bokeh or bokeh, however you want to pronounce that, where you have a camera lens that has to focus on one thing but can't focus on things that are far away, and so you get that nice blurring in the background and foreground. Again, I have a video of that. I'll have a link to that on the screen right now, so you can go ahead and check that video out. But in order to create a depth of field effect very quickly, I'm going to go ahead and select my camera, and just by clicking on the edge of it, or right clicking on the edge of it up here, and then under the camera tab, I'm going to select an object to focus on. I'm actually going to use the eyedropper and just click on the purple gear. And now all I have to do is turn up the size of the aperture. I'm not going to use a radius size. I'm just going to manually sort of guess and check. And if I turn it up to 0.23, you can see that the front or the close part of this gear is getting really blurry, as is the background. I think that's too much though, so I'm going to type in 0.1 and see what that looks like. I like that a little bit more. What I could do here is I could have an empty object as my target instead of the gear.002, and I can move that empty around to specify where exactly I'm focusing on, but I'm just going to leave it as it is. I'm going to try 0.8 or 0.08 rather, and I think I'm happy with that. My gears are spinning, so I'm going to try adding some motion blur as well, and that's under the camera tab. I'll just check motion blur. Again, you only have access to these things if you have the Cycles Render Engine selected, which I hope you do by this point. And so I'm going to enable motion blur. It is, because I checked that box. And the only thing I'm going to adjust here, I think, is this position. I find that end on frame is the most realistic, I think. So I'm going to change it to that. And I'm going to go to a later frame and try rendering it out and see if I can actually see any of my motion blur. So I'm going to go to my render button there, and let's go ahead and see what that looks like. Okay, I don't see much motion blur in the cog, so I'm going to go ahead and change the shutter value. Again, under the camera tab, under motion blur, it's at a 0.5. That value might work very well if you had turned up your physics simulation motor, the speed. Again, I'm not sure if I can actually access that here. I'm going to change my viewport shading to material and select my motor and go to the tab. No, that's not working anymore because I've already baked everything to keyframes. But when you created a motor, there was your angular target velocity speed right there. If I had made the motor spin faster, I would see more motion blur. But I'm going to go ahead and get rid of that because we already have it baked to keyframes. What I'm going to do though is select my camera, and under the camera tab, I'm going to make the shutter larger. So I'll try 1.5, and I'll try rendering out that same frame again. So I'll click on render. And as you can see, we have a little bit of motion blur. You can see it's a little bit fuzzy. It's getting a little bit of blur there. That's great. I'm going to try turning it up a whole lot. I'll turn it up to maybe 4 to see what happens. I think that's too much. Let's go ahead and see what that looks like. Okay, so we have now a substantial amount of motion blur. I think this is actually a little bit too much. So I'm going to turn this down to maybe 2.5 and press enter. Let's go ahead and see what that looks like. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that. We've got a little bit of motion blur, we've got some depth of field, we've got spinning gears. Let's go ahead and render this out. If you've not seen my video on rendering out a movie file in Blender 2.79, that's the version of Blender that I'm using here. Go ahead and check that video out. I'll put a link to that video on the screen right now because we're about to make this into a movie file on my computer. I'll go over the steps really quickly here. I'm going to go ahead and change my render dimensions out to full 100% of 1080p. In Blender 2.79, if you change PNG and you want a movie file, you're going to be selecting FFmpeg video, and when you select FFmpeg video, you get this new encoding section with new options. I'm going to go ahead and select for the container of my video MPEG-4, and then it'll use by default, which is great, the H.264 video codec. I'm going to select high quality, and I don't need any audio, so I'm not going to worry about any audio codec at all. And that's pretty much how easy it is to set up a render for a video file in Blender 2.79. I want to save this video file out to my desktop, so I'm going to navigate to, using this little folder under the output section under the camera tab, to my desktop. I'm going to save this as 85, that's the number of this video, gears, and a little dash. So it'll add the frame numbers right after that dash, which is great. So I'll click on accept, and so it'll be called 85-gears-0001 0250.mp4 because that's the kind of video that we're exporting to. The last step here is to change my render settings to take advantage of my GPU. If you want to learn how to speed up your render times using an NVIDIA based graphics card on your computer, I'll put a link to that video in this video series on the screen right now. On that video, I talk about whether or not you're using a GPU or your CPU. I talk about how to speed up your render times in Cycles because it can take a lot of time or a little bit of time depending on the settings you use down here under the camera tab. Alright, I paused the video just now and I set up my settings for my GPU and my computer to render this out nice and fast. I'll go ahead now and press animation, and we'll come back when we've finished rendering out the entire scene. Alright, so it's finished rendering out. Let's go ahead and press escape, and I'll minimize Blender, and the video file should be on my desktop. Let's go ahead and take a look at it. And as you can see, we've got our finished scene. The gears are moving much slower than I thought they might. I didn't really take a look at how fast they were moving for the sake of this video, so the motion blur doesn't really make sense for how slow they're moving, but there you have it. That will be it for this video. Again, if you like this video, if you're doing something, go ahead and click on that like button below this video, and if you want to see more videos like this one in Blender and in Tech, click on that subscribe button as well. Check out my Facebook page at facebook.com/borncg. On that page, I talk about what I'm working on next and give you out sneak peeks, so check that out. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye.